Welcome to Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
And this is our week in review. Crispin, do the intro.
This is Baltic World, premier channel on current affairs and issues facing Northern, Eastern and Central Europe.
Great. Awesome. And issues facing life and society and anything that Charlene wants to talk about.
Yeah, well, like we said in our video before, the week in review is where we get to discuss the whole world. So we'll obviously, cover comments and things that have developed in relation to the issues that we've discussed, but also taking a broader world view and things of life interest to us in our own lives.
Yeah, which actually brings me to a point. The fact that in that video you mentioned that some people only listen to Week in Review.
Yeah.
So maybe we should notify those of the change that's happening.
Good point.
Dangerous policy.
You may have noticed one change already. We've now changed this to Baltic World. Previously, Dangerous Policy was a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and societies. That rolls off the tongue really easily. But that was discussing issues on a global scale, social, political, geopolitical, and more or less whatever it is that we wanted to discuss. But now that we've hit the milestone of 1,000 subscribers, almost 200 videos, we really wanted to narrow the focus of the channel to give where we can add the most value. And one of the most underserviced areas of the world and things that really need to be elevated are issues facing sort of Sweden, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania. That region of the world, I think, is super critical. And so we're going to be focusing most of our segments on issues facing that part of the world and the people within it. Yeah. Whereas the Week in Review, we will continue to be discussing the whole universe event. So if you only listen to the Week in Review, other than the change to the intro, you probably won't notice that much of a change to what actually happens. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. But anyway, how was your week? What does it feel like to reach the 1,000 subscriber milestone?
Oh, remarkable. I mean, it's kind of weird when there is a massive gap in expectation and reality that you have to go through before this feels like a real milestone. Like when you log into YouTube for the first time, it'll just bombard you with things with hundreds of millions of views, tens of millions of subscribers. And so 1,000 subscribers feels like a tiny little channel compared to the actual content that you're exposed to. But as you start making videos, dealing with the algorithm, going through the entire life cycle of what it creates to develop a video and upload it and deal with everything, the results from it, getting subscribers is incredibly challenging. And the vast majority of people who attempt to be content creators never get to 1,000 subscribers, and probably more than half never get to 100.
You just reflect on your own attitude, as we are also consumers of YouTube. I'm also very picky of who I subscribe to. It's weird, right? Like other social media platforms, I'll be like, oh yeah, I'll follow you. I'll like your page on Facebook. But somehow, when you subscribe to a channel on YouTube, it's kind of like, yes, I do want to see more of your stuff. It's more of an investment. Anything. Yeah, you're right. There is a psychological gap you get over to subscribe to YouTube as opposed to clicking like on something. I totally agree. So I mean, it's good that people do hit the like button on the videos because it helps with the channel, helps with the algorithm. But subscription is where it's all at. And getting 1,000 subscribers, if you tell a random normie who's never done YouTube that you have 1,000 subscribers, they might be polite and be like, oh, yeah, because it is. It's it's something. But it's not terribly impressive for them. Whereas having gone through it, it's really difficult to get to this milestone. And it makes the next milestone seem a lot easier, because you learn so much in the 200 videos or so that we've made that... very confident that we have the opportunity for growth. And one of the reasons, of course, that we focus on this spectrum is of issues, so Baltic issues, is it helps us focus the promotion of the channel. So, if we have one topic on public debt in Japan and birth rates in
in Argentina or whatever. Well, it's very hard to go, okay, well, who's going to be attracted to the channel long term? They'll come across one video that they like, and then they may never see it again. I mean, we did that one video on Meghan Markle, which is very popular. But if you were interested in, say, the British monarchy, how much would you get out of this channel by subscribing? And the answer is not a lot. You have that one video, and otherwise there's really not much to it. So having a focused emphasis of subject matter will allow us to promote the channel in a much more concentrated way. And also the fact that it's niche but something that we're very interested in, and also that there isn't enough servicing in this area. There aren't people reporting in English with an international perspective on what's going on in Eastern and Northern Europe. That just isn't happening, which is one of the reasons YouTube likes it, because it gets to service people that otherwise would never get this content. So, so there's a lot of incentive for us to do that and make us more disciplined in the way in which we focus our segments and think. Because
why isn't Eastern Europe serviced? Like, there's just so many cool things about it. Like, I think the other day you showed me how there's an underground church.
Yeah,
they caved out. Like, how is that not like, you know, like equivalent to Eiffel Tower? You know, like it's. I don't understand.
Well, yeah, and travel's just one dimension of it, and that's true for so many countries. I mean, I love Traky Castle in Lithuania. I haven't been to Marienburg, or Magdeburg Castle, the Teutonic Order's main fortress. Which, you know, in the pictures looks amazing. Hunădura Castle in Romania, I absolutely love.
I want to go to Romania.
And yeah, there are just many parts just on a travel basis that are under-serviced. But more than that, Eastern Europe is really critical for global affairs. And particularly now with the expansion of the European Union. So until 2004, the European Union was very much a kind of Western Europe NATO affair. Okay, so you had, during the Cold War, the West German, and then the west of that, France, UK, Spain, and so on. And then you had Eastern Europe under Soviet occupation. And NATO was a military alliance focused against the Soviet Union. And within that context, European economic cooperation emerged, evolving into the EU. So it's very much a sort of Western European kind of focused centric entity. And then beginning sort of in 2004 and then again in 2007, it really expanded into Eastern Europe to include all the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, and the like. And that really changed the character of the European Union because they have different values, they have different outlook, and they have different concerns. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Spanish or French don't think about Russian invasion, right? They don't imagine that the Soviet armies are going to be marching to the Atlantic coast. They just don't think about it. They think more about, you know, terrorism, things that are going on in the Middle East. And then the EU is very much a product of trying to manage wildly different economies within a fairly bloated Euro area. So you've got what's going on in Greece versus Germany, you know, versus Bulgaria, you know, as opposed to Portugal. Very different economies, very different systems, even within certain countries, like the difference between southern and northern Italy, quite different the way things work. So it's very, very difficult and cumbersome to manage. But in that, you can see patterns where things are quite different in sort of the Poland and Baltic states, where they're still very much focused on Russia in a security sense. You've also got...
Just didn't happen that long ago, to be honest.
It didn't happen that long ago. And also, I would say that having lived under communism, under truly the yoke of these totalitarian regimes, the Eastern Europeans are far more cognizant of where a lot of the political trends in the West end up, and also much more focused on their own national identity. So Poland is very sort of nationalistic. And then also with Lithuania being very principled in its foreign policy. So like, we don't want to deal with the totalitarian communist regime in China because they oppress their own people, they're oppressing the Taiwanese, and we know what that's like. And so they have a higher degree of awareness of the ethics and morality of dealing with certain different governments and the long-term implications of any kind of dependency in a way that the Western Europeans have not. I mean, so Australia has learned that lesson the hard way. We've become economically dependent on China. Admittedly, initially, China wasn't as oppressive internationally as it is now. But there was an expectation that as China grew, it would become more democratic and more peaceful. That and the opposite happened.
Took a blind eye and what they were doing in China and it's all the Chinese money. Yes, come boost our economy here in Australia, and then not realizing that you can't separate the two, really.
Yeah, there's a line that Australian politicians used for decades, and it was, Australia does not need to choose between Washington and Beijing. We can have a good relationship with both countries simultaneously. This is what the Australian government, now we haven't heard that from an Australian politician in 4 or 5 years, but for 2 decades, that was the only thing that they would say whenever asked this question, or perfectly trained by their public servants to mutter out that speech. And with this delusion that things were going to change in China and it will be okay. Well, Lithuania is certainly not making that mistake. And I think that's true for Eastern and Central Europe in a way that Western Europe just has been so complacent for so long. And thus really elevating the voices of Eastern Europe can really provide a good reflection on what's happening in the rest of the world. Yeah. And this isn't just, all negative. I would hope our channel can foster in a constructive way without diminishing anyone's feelings or rightful historical injustices and things. Foster in a constructive way improve relations and dialogue between different groups. So I would like to see the Baltic and Poland and so on gradually improve their relations with Russia for various reasons without in any way diminishing their own sovereignty or identity or anything like that. It should be on equal terms. But I would like to see that happen. And I would also like for, Poland and Lithuania and so on, recognize how similar they are relative to Western Europe. I mean, certainly there's a lot of historical issues and complexities, as I said in my history video. But there is more to their relationship. I mean, put it this way: Scotland and England, they might banter a lot, and they might have some historical arguments, and certainly Scots are way more left on the political spectrum than the English. And yet they obviously have much more in common than either of them have with Bulgaria, right? Yeah. So that kind of the differences between the Balts and the Slavs has to be kind of juggled with the similarities, and I would like to explore that as well. And also there are some English-speaking kind of news reporting. So the Baltic Times has been publishing news from the Baltic states since the 90s, I think twice a month or something. So it's not super regular, but it's just been this small little thing. That's their one English language news publication. And if you think about the era that we're in of global media, 24-hour news cycle, there is a great opportunity for us as a channel to focus on news stories of relevance to that part of the world and also, surrounding areas that aren't reported on in English at all. And no one would do a video on it. The Baltic Times is still print media, whereas no one's, on YouTube telling this stuff. So this is a great opportunity for us to create a service as well as a channel, a service of media, a service of reporting, and of actual coverage of issues, not just of importance to people in that region, but for the entire rest of the world, noting, as I mentioned, the differences that exist in that part of the world that those in the West just aren't properly cognizant of. And then finally, I would say that much of the cultural custodianship of the West now kind of rests on the shoulders of Central and Eastern Europe in a way. The West is going through a massive crisis of confidence, about history, Western identity, whether or not, we should all be ashamed of our colonial past and things. Whereas Central and Eastern Europe aren't going through that problem in the same way. They still focus very much on classic literature. There is a wonderful video that you guys should go out and check. It's a channel called Lessons in the Screenplay, and it's by this expert screenwriter. He's basically an educational thing on how to do good scripts.
Yeah.
But he does this interview on his second channel, so you'll find it, on the Witcher 3 game, right? Which is one of the great all-time storytelling phenomenons of a computer game. And they interview all the Polish writers about, the Slavic roots of these kind of myths and so on, but also the story arc going through each of the major characters of the famous Red Baron story arc. And I'm just thinking, man, it's been a long time since I've heard like people in Hollywood sit down and talk about real stories and human condition and struggles of people against the nature of their own soul. The only things that really are worth talking about. And so in many sense, like Eastern and Central Europe is where Western culture still thrives in its natural state. And I really appreciate that. So I think the great works of literature, of art, of music will come out of that region. Because in much of the rest of the world, at least for the past 10 years and probably for the next 20, we've really abandoned a lot of those things. Like we'll call like, Poland's Chopin will be like white supremacy or something. And the Europeans just aren't worried about that. So it gives an opportunity to cover like, emerging music, emerging, as I said, literature, performance art, fine art. Those are things that will continue to come out in that part of the world, which we should be reminded of in a positive way.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's kind of exciting. Well, for me anyway, I've grown up in Australia. Obviously, I'm an European. That's like the obvious fact. I have an Asian, Malaysian background. So a lot of the things that I've learned throughout this journey through Danish policy and now into Baltic World is uncovering all these stories. And I think for many of us in my people in my shoes will be excited to learn more. Yeah. Going into the Lithuanian history video, finally part 3, is the fact that, when we were discussing the video, how they had a Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth, but everyone just says the Poland Commonwealth, like they kind of miss out the Lithuania. Why is that missing in history? Like it's a big part of the history.
It's a great question. And first of all, like a lot of people have been waiting for part 3. And this is the reason why, is that you'll notice in that video, I really do go into, Lithuania within the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. And that takes a lot of research because historians just don't talk about that in a concentrated way as a general rule.
And they were like a dominant power, like just how much area they took. Like, I don't understand how.
Well, I mean, the explanation for how the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became such a power, we will cover in a future series. So that when I mentioned in the beginning, when I talk about the Wars of Succession and the Northern Crusades, there are so many players. There's the Teutonic Order, the Kingdom of Novgorod, even the Golden Horde, the Mongols. Like there are, there's so much to discuss there. But I didn't want to just touch on it and not do it justice. I know in the previous history video, part 2, I do mention some major battles and things, but no, I'm like, this needs to be its own series. So we will revisit that in a future time. But to answer your question, I think that there is one reason for why Lithuania is a bit skipped over that's almost their own fault, which is that because Lithuania was so effective at maintaining separation and identity within the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, the Polish king had so many titles, right? You're the King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, and they were always separate. So it's hard to say, that the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania in every sentence. So people are going to naturally shorten it. And because the seat of government was in Poland, they would say the Polish king, King of Poland. And that was just, I think, easier for people, and it made people really lazy. So when people say, because people have an image of Poland as its own country, and they know how big it is and where it's located.
Yeah.
When people say the King of Poland today, they imagine just the King of Poland, and they don't even think about that Lithuania was a part of it.
Yeah.
And at one stage, Lithuania's territory was even bigger. So it is unfortunate. I also think that, I mean, there's population. So when Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth was constituted, the majority of the population was Polish. And within Lithuania, as I talk about in the video, because it was such a mix within the country, it was almost an empire of its own right. It had Ruthenians, it had both Protestants and Orthodox, it had Samagotians. So there were, Jews, Tatars, like many different types of ethnicities within Lithuania, whereas Poland was a little bit more homogenous. So it's to say, okay, well, it depends on how much you reduce Lithuania down to in terms of identity. If it's the territory of Lithuania, which is the way I kind of address it in the video, and the way they refer to themselves, they're like, yeah, we're all Lithuanians.
Because they come from Rome.
Exactly. Origin myths and, these sorts of things. Then it had a huge influence, and you can talk about it in that context. But if you go, okay, specifically the ethnic Lithuanians who were the Baltic peoples who only spoke Lithuanian, and they came from this region, but we're not the Samagotians, but, very hard to pit it down to that degree of granularity and then pick that out and say, well, this was the influence that these people had on all of the Polish-Lithuania as a whole. So in that sense, it becomes complicated. But we should recognize that there has been a shift in who we call Lithuanians, right? So
who do we call Lithuanians?
Well, today it's the Baltic people who live in Lithuania, right? And they do have their own language. So it's mostly Lithuanian speakers. We have a language that we call Lithuanian, and the people who speak that language as their primary language, we would say are the Lithuanians, right? Whereas during the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, it incorporated much of modern-day Belarus, Latvia, much of Estonia, Western Russia, parts of Ukraine, and a plurality of languages and ethnicities and religions all within that territory. They would call themselves Lithuanians, but they wouldn't speak Lithuanian. Yeah, they wouldn't speak Lithuanian. So there has been that shift over time, and so what it means to be Lithuanian has become more narrow, and I think that's part of the reason why they've slipped down the hierarchy a bit in terms of when people talk about the history. And then of course just the writings of history. So the reason why we could talk in much more detail in part 3 than say part 1 is in part 1 we're really relying on Tacitus, who and a few other contemporary sources, but they were Romans, they were of the senatorial class, they wrote about what they understood as being, the Baltic tribes are a bit like the Germanic tribes in this different ways, but they have these differences and so on. It's very much a distant kind of observation. Whereas by the time we get to the 15th, 16th, 17th century, everything is being written down. There's all these treaties. There's all like we can talk about Yugawa's life and times in extraordinary detail and his relationships and his foreign policy in a way that you just could never dream of doing that about any Baltic person of any kind in the ancient period. And that is all written in Polish, right? So until Yugawa becomes ruler of Poland, obviously it's all in Lithuanian. Yeah. But then when the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth emerges 150 years later, most things that are done by the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth are written in Polish, and the language of government is Polish. So people just get used to talking about things in the vernacular of Poland, without really recognizing that actually it's way, way more complex than that. But I do want to stress that it had to be a significant influence from Lithuania purely by the fact that they had so many religions generally getting along. Right? People can't really imagine now what it would be like during the 30 Years' War to have all these different religions together. Like it's hard to picture in that context. And the idea also that you'd have all these Orthodox Ruthenians staying absolutely loyal to Lithuania, despite being at war with the other Orthodox power in the region, Russia, is quite unique. So we all should be, in order for the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth to function, Lithuania actually had to be a really strong partner supporting and believing in that union, because otherwise it would have all easily fallen apart. I mean, like 250 years in, not just 250 years, which is an extraordinary time, but in the most complicated, disruptive, destructive period of European history until that time. And that's quite an achievement. So Lithuania and Poland did do a lot together successfully.
Right.
Yep.
So let's change topic here.
Mm-hmm.
This past week commemorates 20 years since the anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah.
And it's really odd for me because, okay, I'm a baby. So I was a baby when 9/11 happened. So I actually feel quite far removed from the impact of 9/11. The only distinct memory I have is my parents and family members watching the TV, like with gaping eyes and everything like that. But that's all I remember. So I guess, I don't know, the way that the world has moved, you know, the attitudes towards the East and the West and the Taliban, all those kind of things, I fully don't understand. And maybe the new generation don't understand either.
Well, that's actually the word you use there is generation. And I think that's very palpable in the impact and legacy of that event. I mean, and just a quick aside, I'll come back to it, but remembering that we've just pulled out of Afghanistan, young people your age in Afghanistan would have been there and not have remembered or even lived through 9/11, being told about it by the parents and previous generations. So it's extraordinary what impact that's had psychologically throughout the years. But I'll pick on the generation thread first, because every generation has its like moment of geopolitical fixture that everyone from that generation uses as a reference point for which to interpret the world.
Right.
So older people who are around today, like go back a couple of generations, it was the war, right? Second World War, that's how they saw the world. The generation before that, the First World War and the Great Depression, right? So those were First World War, Great Depression, Second World War. That was the major thing. Then for sort of parents and grandparents, it was the Cold War, the nuclear age, the threat of nuclear annihilation, the facing off of the United States and the Soviet Union, the challenge between democracy and communism, Vietnam, the first Afghanistan war, everything like Berlin Airlift, Korea, all these big things that were seen in the struggle of this bipolar universal moment.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the Soviet Union, I would say with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that was another event, I think, for sort of the later Gen Xers who lived through the unipolar American moment. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the falling away of communism, the great expansion of liberalism, the expansion of the EU and NATO across Europe, all of that stuff, America seemed like the ruler of the world by far. Their power was so far beyond any nearest rival that it just seemed like the future was written in the American tongue.
I do remember my parents always saying, everything's made in US, this is made in US, blah, blah, blah. And then it just suddenly shifted, everything's made in China.
That's true. I mean, America's cultural, military, social, economic preeminence was just vastly great. And everyone it had a certain fixture to it. People, even though this had only happened in the last year or two in the 90s, people seem to believe that this was something that was going to exist for 500, 1,000 years.
Before
so this was
9/11 though. Was terrorism a thing? Like, was it such a...
Well, this is the great question, right? So during that decade, the 90s, it was thought that America was so much more powerful than everybody else that liberal democracy would spread unfettered across the world, and that there would be this new world order. And I think the culmination of that was the 2000 Sydney Olympics, where great hope for the new millennium. I mean, I remember the parties of 1999, where the new millennium was called it, and it was thought universally positive. No great fear. It was all resting on hope and optimism, and everyone's going to get wealthier, and human civilization is going to enjoy the utopian Star Trek future, and these legacy issues of North and South Korea and all that, that's all going to go away. And people were really looking forward optimistically to the future. Then there was a really tight election between Al Gore and George W. Bush that all rested on 500 votes in Florida to swing the whole nation, and it all went to the Supreme Court, and it was all very contested. George Bush becomes the president, and then initially in his first 100 days, it looked like the conflicts, such as they were, would be with China. There was issues with a submarine, there was like a plane crash somewhere, and there were real hostility initially between the Chinese Communist Party and the United States. There's also issues with Russia's war in Chechnya. So Vladimir Putin, not been on the scene yet, but basically they had, the Russian wars in Chechnya were considered very violent, chemical weapons being used. And so there was some hostility there as well. So that first 3 months seemed like, okay, there'll be some geopolitical competition, but with America vastly more powerful.
Yeah.
Then September 11 happened, and I saw the second plane crash live. The first plane crash hits, and then that goes blanket media coverage worldwide. And people were talking in great confusion. They were like, look at this, what was happened. But it was like, okay, this could be a terrible accident. Nobody knows what happened. And then seconds later, the second plane crash, I'm like, okay, no, this is a major attack. And then a plane hits the Pentagon. A plane crashes in Pennsylvania. Like, they're just... like, the sky was raining on the United States. Nobody had any idea where any of this was coming from. And it was all happening live, like people witnessing it with their own eyes, like people falling out of the building's coming down.
Who makes a building that tall? I know, that's so stupid, but...
Well, yeah, but it was, the World Trade Center was a testimony to American greatness, and which is one of the reasons, no doubt, it was targeted.
I hope there's regulations on their buildings now, right? Like depending on height, right? I'm sure.
Well, yes, I'm sure. Well, one hopes. Certainly, there's been massive changes to air travel since then. But that event had a massive legacy and psychological impact on an entire generation, particularly of Americans. Because until that time, America had never been attacked. Like, even during World War II, the United States was the only major player never to be touched by the war. They sent all their troops abroad, but they weren't bombed at home. So this was extraordinary. And any thought of China, Russia, anybody else just went totally out the window. And from that moment on, the only word in town was terrorism, right? Like the war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, and everything got reframed. So Russia's war in Chechnya, the Chechens were Islamic, right? So the Russia and the US cooperated. Russia was saying, oh yeah, this is our own war on terror, right? Like people stopped talking about the human rights things there. It was all like, oh yeah, Russia's dealing with its problems in Chechnya. The Uyghurs in China, like no one talked about them. And America went off into these massive misadventures in the Middle East. It was also when the progressive liberal thing started to get legs, but in a constructive way, because the Iraq war was an absolute catastrophe unfolding before people's very eyes. The media really questioned its own role in cheerleading that conflict. It led to all kinds of new legislation, such as the Patriot Act, which really clamped down on American rights. Like, so you think about the pandemic today and how people are willing to give up all kinds of freedoms. Well, that first wave happened because of the fear of further attacks, right? So that had happened previously. And then it was the sort of Edward Snowden revelations, Glenn Greenwald, like the massive overreach of the American industrial complex, the deep state, taking every American's phone records and just this massive collection of data that they didn't have any legal right to. And so it really created a sort of a tension between the government and the people.
Yeah.
And led to what we see today. But it's interesting because there was that, what I would say, a massive distraction. The generations of people who were in government when September 11 occurred, they had a Cold War mindset. They were still from that Cold War era. Like if you think of the senior political leaders in America at the time, they weren't brought up during the unipolar moment of American power. They were brought up during the Cold War. So they saw, okay, well, the Cold War's over, which means America has no threats except for this. This is the main threat. And they focused absolutely on the Middle East and ignored totally the rise of China, thinking that they would never be a competitor of the United States.
Yeah.
Barack Obama was the first post-Cold War leader where he, obviously was affected by 9/11, but he'd been against the Iraq War at the time when Hillary Clinton was for it. And so he had that kind of new American vibe, this sort of like, okay, the Cold War is not part of his worldview. His generation worldview is this unipolar American moment where if America acts with leadership in the world, everything will be okay. So he got this, he was very anti-Iraq War, very anti-conflict on terror sort of thing, but he pushed it too far. He didn't realize the fixtures and legacy of the Cold War that actually had value for the United States. So, for example, he really tried to hand things over to the Iranians, which he shouldn't have done. He sort of abandoned Israel, which he shouldn't have done. And that weakened America's position in the world in certain ways, but did make America think a little bit more about the world beyond, the desert sands of Afghanistan, right? He did talk about China, he talked about the pivot, all of those things were abandoned, but at least he understood the way the geopolitical winds were moving. The biggest legacy for people like you who don't remember the 9/11 properly, right, or its impact politically before that, was that, there's two. One is that the world in which you have grown up in has been far less hopeful than the world that I grew up in. So when I kind of came of age in the 90s, the future was bright. People were excited about what would happen in the 21st century, in the next millennia. Like interstellar space travel, all this seems real and happening. And these problems that we have among each other, there'll be some alien invasion like Independence Day, and we'll all band together and it'll all be fine, right? So there was this real sense of common humanity, common future. We'll get rid of nuclear weapons and the threat of annihilation, all that stuff. That's all the thing of the past. And that sense of that optimism you have not experienced, right? Like you've grown up in a world where things have been getting more hostile, more complicated. The age of social media, doing all, making everyone super depressed and super tribal and getting into their own echo chambers and things. Like the world, human society, human interaction, human outlook has gotten worse. Even as people have been lifted out of poverty and there have been some positive things, people are living longer, medical advances are getting better, nutrition is getting better. So certain things are getting better, but you've grown up in a world with the shadow of, terrorism, these 9/11. Like 9/11 just seems so impossible until it actually happened.
Yeah. It's funny actually, to say that I grew up in a world that has less, quote unquote, less hope, but I guess I don't have a comparison. Like I've grown up in this world and that is what I have. And like, it's so funny. I think human beings, like my generation, is very easily adapt to this world.
No, absolutely, yes.
And it's kind of like you can either choose to see the light or you can choose to see the darkness. And I guess, the only crisis I think my generation has faced is right now, actually, is COVID-19. Before that, we have extraordinary economic boom in every single aspect of our lives.
Well, we have in Australia, okay, we didn't have the financial crisis.
Oh yeah, we didn't have the financial crisis.
So it's true in Australia that we've had this great run because the rise of China had been really good for us until recently. But the Europeans, that's not true. America, that's not true. Like they've had bumps in the road as they've went. Like the hollowing out of the middle class. It wasn't until Trump that the middle class had any pay rise at all wealth going to the top 1%. Like so Australia has done okay socially, and so that would be true, but that wouldn't be true for much of the audience.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can only speak from my own experience. Is that what I have seen from me and my own experience and people around me is that has not been a single, I guess, external crisis, I guess climate change would be a big thing, and then COVID-19. Like for the most part, it's actually been quite crazy. But I don't have a fixed point. Like I don't have the 90s to compare to because I was born in the 90s, late 90s.
Yes, but this is really good in a way because your generation has a much more realist outlook, and I compare this to the political leaders that we have today and in previous years.
We're so much more cynical of politicians, though.
That's true. That's true. But there is one great advantage that you have that previous generations do not.
The internet?
No. It's understanding that America's place in the world is not fixed. This is something I hope the audience can take away as well. In up and through the 90s, people genuinely had a view that American leadership, dominance, preeminence in the world would last 1,000 years. And I mean like 1,000 years. Like it would be the new Rome, it would surpass Rome. Like America was omnipresently powerful. And given the psychological scar of 9/11, its catastrophic strategic reaction to it getting bogged down in these wars that have lasted for decades, and the extraordinarily rapid rise of China, your generation understands that the world can change quickly, that there is no fixtures in the world. There are just trend lines, and you should follow those trend lines. So the younger generation can imagine a world where China is the most powerful country, right? Like it's just a natural, like it's not hard for you to picture China being the most powerful country.
No, there's some instances I thought it was.
But in America, older generations, impossible. Like they just could not conceive of that eventuality. And so when Joe Biden in particular, president, his rhetoric is hardened up a bit now because he has to, but all through the campaign, remember this guy's been in politics for 50 years. He used to be vice president. All through the campaign, he's like, oh no, China's not really a threat to the United States. The US is still dominant in pretty much every way. That's simply not true. It's just that he can't imagine that not being the case. Like it's a fixture of his world. And because you've been living and growing up in a world that has been rapidly shifting, the world has changed so much faster since 9/11 than it had in the previous, like since the Second World War. Like the world looks more different between 2001 and 2021 than it does between 1946 and 1989, right? Like it just, the time scale of change is dramatically truncated.
I had someone say, was regretting with all the things happening right now. It was like, oh, I've just brought up my daughter in this world. Daughter's like 5. And it's like, I can't believe I have this. Like, this is a terrible world to grow up in. I'm like, really? I don't know. I mean, yes, maybe. Like, but I don't know.
No. Geopolitically, it's devastating and getting worse. But individually, like, childhood diseases are basically eradicated. Education access, like everyone can access all of human knowledge instantly, almost for free on the internet.
People are living longer. Like there are just more opportunities.
Yes.
Overall, like
so it's a great place and time to raise a child. Yes, there are major difficulties like accessing the housing market for most young people across the world is a catastrophic problem. Intergenerational wealth challenges. Obviously, the lockdowns and restrictions, and yes, a deteriorating relationship between China and the United States will come to a head. But in terms of the individual characteristics by which we measure human well-being, they do continue to march forward.
But I can see like how all these like big issues like kind of like comes all trickling down like a huge burden, or what feels like a burden on your life.
Yeah,
right, because these things are just out of your control.
Yeah, it's there are things that are deteriorating, but no, it's a great time to have children and raise a family. If you compare it to periods, the reason why people are so depressed and so unhappy, in part, is because of the media cycle is now less than 24 hours, and if it bleeds, it leads. Like, you will hear all about the terrible things that are happening in the world because that's what gets people's attention.
Sometimes I feel like it'd be so much better if I just like put myself in a box and just like, la la la, the world's great, and just like turn it off the media.
I shouldn't say this as a journalist now.
We'll update
the audience in a sec. But it is true, I believe, that Thomas Jefferson once said, so founding father of the United States, 18th century, hundreds of years ago, said, the person who cannot read is more educated than the person who only reads newspapers. And that there's an element of truth to that, particularly today with the biases in media. But yeah, I'll finish off with some personal news.
Yeah,
I am absolutely delighted and excited to announce that I am a reporter for the Epoch Times. For those that don't know, Epoch is perhaps the fastest growing media outlet in the world. It's grown like 450% like the last 2 years, but it's been around for more than 20. It was established by dissidents in China who were fighting against the Communist Party, trying to get the truth of what was happening in China to the rest of the world. So obviously sort of Cold War era distribution. But now it exists. It's based in New York. It exists in like 35 countries, 20 languages. And I'm reporting mostly on Australian foreign policy, relations with China, its place in the world. And this is actually one of, not a major driving force, we would have done this anyway, I think, but one of the impetuses behind changing this channel to being more Baltic-centric, so that there isn't as much conflict of interest between my reporting and my day job and doing this as well, because this will be much more centered on the Baltic. Having said that, my first article with the Epoch Times, and I'll leave a link in the description for those that might be interested, does talk about Lithuania and the solidarity that the EU is showing against China's bullying against Lithuania. It's not the focus of the article, but it does reference it. So yeah, there'll be some crossover there as well. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be part of the Epoch Times because they've gotten so much right over the past 20 years. They got Trump's rise right. They understood the geopolitical changes with the CCP. And they are committed to genuine journalism at a time when the New York Times, the Atlantic, these legacy institutions have really failed and let people down.
Yeah,
they've done really, really great. And I can speak, and I can say this, I don't want to give away anything from my conversations internally, but when I put something up, my managing editor is very strict. She's like, no, this has to be balanced. This has to be factual. The audience has to make up their own mind. Classic principles of journalism at play. So I'm really pleased to be working for them and to lift my own quality to match their standards.
Amazing. Like, I'm pleased because makes less poker time.
No, it doesn't. I've more poker time. I love poker. Yeah, still playing poker, but it does mean that I can say I'm a journalist and not a poker player.
Not a poker player. People don't be like, "What do you do again?" Like, he's like, "Oh, I like to rearrange equity and."
Probabilistic statistician,
yeah. Anyway. Actually, I also had that video of Afghanistan, but it's not related to editing of that video. Even though the video was like 6 minutes long, I have put so much love and energy into that video. It probably got suppressed by YouTube, but I don't care.
Yeah, it did. We like, it's funny, now that we have monetization, like, it will tell us, basically, the algorithm's more clear cut about what it does with our videos. And yeah, that was demonetized straight away, flatlined on. So I think only subscribers really got to see it.
Yeah.
But Charlene did an amazing, incredible job with that. If you haven't seen it, go check out that video. Just the graphics are awesome. The number counting, that's not easy to do. So that was a hell of a triumph.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I never explored After Effects because it's been like, I don't know, just there's so much you can do with it, right? But I guess what I wanted to comment on was like, you know, when beginning of starting Danish policy, like I had to learn all these different skills, and then now I've got into the groove of things and routine. It's been like, oh yeah, I'm used to it. But then going to the After Effects and trying to get that video happening, I was back into that learning, and I was just like, you know, that zone, you're in the zone, and you're like, oh, this is so good. Afterwards, I was exhausted. But it was great experience, and hopefully, you know, it can only go up from here. So that, yeah, the Lithuanian history video. Yeah, I hope people will like it.
Yes.
But otherwise, yeah.
So just, I guess, finishing off, thank you everybody for being with us on this journey so far. It's been a remarkable experience. So much work. We're about to go out and celebrate again. So there are so many things that we're looking forward to as well in the future. So stick with us. Thank you for being part of this journey so far.
Yeah.
And hopefully go from strength to strength. Like, we'll be marketing very much to the target audience. So hopefully the community will grow rapidly from here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just really excited for this part of the future. Despite what we're having in the world, despite the other life challenges, one of the great shining diamonds of both of our lives has been this process. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your support, and I do agree. Even though, despite what's happening in the world, like I get really excited after work and editing a video and looking at YouTube and everything like that. So yeah, only up from here. That's all the time we have for today. So any comments, any feedback, please leave them down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, stay safe and
ciao for now.